They came at the house the way men come at something they think can't hit back. 3 of them, a padlock and a paper folded twice in a jacket pocket. And the first thing that happened that morning was the sound of a bolt cutter biting through the chain on Ruth Callahan's front gate. A hard, bright snap that carried all the way down Miller Road in the cold. She was 71 years old, and she came out onto her own porch in a housecoat and slippers, and the tallest of the 3 men, the one holding the paper, told her she had 20 minutes to take what she could carry. And then he did the thing that turned a bad morning into something else entirely. He walked past her, into her kitchen, and he took the framed photograph off the wall above the stove, the one of her husband in his navy dress blues, and he set it face down on the counter like it was trash he'd get to later. There were 4 neighbors standing at the end of that driveway, and not one of them moved. The old man who fixed small engines 2 doors down was ordinary in every way a man can be ordinary. Gray in the hair, 74 years on him, hands that hadn't made a fist in a long, long time, wearing a canvas work apron with oil worn into the seams. What those 3 men in the good boots did not know, standing on that frozen lawn with their paper and their padlock, was exactly who lived 2 doors down. A long time ago, hard men in 3 countries used to go quiet when his name came up in a room. Nobody on Miller Road that morning had the first idea what was about to happen, least of all the tall one, the one who'd touched the photograph. And I'll tell you now that before this was over, 41 motorcycles would be parked bumper to bumper around a courthouse square, and not one of them would break a single law. Sit with me on this one. It's worth the whole hour. Let me take you back about 40 minutes, because you need to feel the whole shape of it before you watch what happens to the men who came for Ruth Callahan's house. It started with a letter, the way these things always start. An official envelope with a return address that was just a suite number in a city 2 hours away. Ruth had gotten 3 of them over the winter. She'd paid the property taxes on that house for 44 years, paid them on time, paid them the year her husband Dell was dying, and the year after when the grief had her so flat she forgot to eat. But there'd been a lien, a small one, a thing about a sewer assessment the county had botched and never fixed. $612 that grew teeth in the dark, the way these numbers do. $612. Remember that number. It's going to come back around. And when it does, I want you to feel exactly how small it was against everything it cost. A company called Meridian Asset Recovery bought that debt off the county for pennies, and then they did what companies like that do. They let the clock run. They let the fees stack. They mailed her letters printed to look confusing on purpose, and when she called the number on the paper, she got a machine, and the machine got her nowhere. By the time she understood what was happening, the house was already scheduled for what they called a tax deed auction, and the man who ran Meridian, the man whose signature was at the bottom of every letter, had already decided her house was as good as sold. Now let me tell you about the old man 2 doors down, because everything that matters comes from him, and you can't understand the morning until you understand the hour he kept. His name was Amos Reed, and for 19 years he'd opened the roll-up door of a little cinder block shop at the front of his property at 7 in the morning, 6 days a week. And inside that shop he fixed lawnmowers and outboard motors and the occasional chainsaw for anybody who brought one by. 7 o'clock, every morning, 19 years. You could set a watch by the sound of that door going up. The whole street smelled like 2-stroke oil and cut grass and coffee, and that smell was as much a part of Miller Road as the road itself. Amos was big in a way that had nothing to do with size. He wasn't tall, he wasn't wide, but rooms arranged themselves around him without anybody deciding to let them. Quiet, mostly, but when Amos spoke, people leaned in without meaning to. And they'd lean in whether he was telling them the carburetor was shot or telling them nothing at all. His hands were the kind of hands that had done terrible work once and had spent 2 decades learning to do gentle work instead. And if you looked close, you'd see they moved slow now, careful, like a man who decided a long time ago that slow was a choice he was going to keep making. There was a girl who worked for him, Del Callahan's granddaughter, Nora, 22 years old, sharp as a tack, and quiet in the way of somebody who'd learned early that talking got you hurt. She'd shown up on Miller Road 8 months back with a duffel bag and a black eye that was going yellow at the edges, running from a man in another state whose name nobody said out loud. And Ruth had taken her in, and Amos had done the thing Amos did. He handed her a shop apron and a key, and never once asked her a single question about where she'd been. He just showed her how to gap a spark plug, and how to read a man's face when he came in the door. And inside a month, she could tear down a 2-stroke engine faster than he could. And inside 2 months, she'd stopped flinching when a wrench dropped. He never raised his voice at her, not once. And that, more than anything, was the thing that healed her. She poured him a cup of black coffee every morning at 7:10, and he never asked for it, and she never stopped bringing it. And that was the whole language between them. The town had been dying by inches for a while. The mill closed. The young ones left. And into that slow quiet came Meridian Asset Recovery, and the man who ran it. And I need to tell you about him now, because he's the reason for all of it. His name was Kyle Brandt, and he was 29 years old, and he wore a suit the color of wet slate and a watch worth more than Ruth's whole first car. He had a tattoo on the inside of his right wrist, a small compass rose, done cheap when he was 17, and he'd kept it even after the good suits came because it reminded him of where he'd started. He had a smile he used like a tool, a smile that never once made it all the way up to his eyes. Kyle Brandt built Meridian on fear, the way other men build things on trust, because fear was faster, and fear scaled. And by the time anybody thought to fight him, the paper had already moved, and the clock had already run. I'll tell you where the wound came from, because it matters, and because it doesn't excuse a single thing. His father had been a man who owned a hardware store in a small town not unlike this one, and a bank had taken it, slow, with letters printed to look confusing on purpose. And his father had stood in the parking lot on the last day and cried in front of his son, and never once raised his voice or his hand or his name against the men who did it. Kyle Brandt watched his father swallow that humiliation whole, watched him die a few years later without ever answering for it. And somewhere in there, the boy made a decision. He was never going to be the one crying in the parking lot. He was going to be the one holding the paper. He never learned the other lesson, the one his father was actually trying to teach him. He learned only the fear. The first time anybody from Meridian came to Ruth's door, it wasn't Kyle. It was a young man in a cheaper suit who left a notice taped to the glass, and Ruth walked it down to Amos's shop with her hands shaking. And Amos read it twice, slow, and set it on the workbench next to a carburetor he was cleaning. Nora watched his face and saw nothing move on it, which frightened her more than anger would have. Ruth asked him what she should do, and Amos said one word. He said, "Wait." And she waited, because when Amos said a thing in that voice, you waited. What he didn't tell Ruth, what he didn't tell Nora, was that he'd already made a phone call that afternoon, a call to a number he hadn't dialed in 11 years, and that on the other end of that call, a man 20 years younger than Amos had gone very still and then said, "Just tell me when." Amos hoped it wouldn't come to that. He hoped Meridian would look at a 71-year-old widow's house and see too much trouble for too little money and move on to easier prey. He was wrong about that, the way careful men are sometimes wrong when they hope. It came to that. Now, before I show you the morning finish the way it started, I have to show you the wall of that little cinder block shop, because there was a photograph on it, up in the corner where the light was bad, and nobody who came in ever asked about it because nobody could make it out. It was black and white, curling at one corner, and it showed a long row of motorcycles on a coast highway, and a line of men standing in front of them, and in the middle of that line, younger, dark-haired, was Amos Reed. Above his heart on the leather was a set of wings, and under the wings a name. And to the men in that photograph, and to a great many men still living, those wings meant one specific thing. Amos Reed had been there at the start of something. Not a member, a founder. One of the small handful of men who'd put the whole thing on the road when it was nothing but a name and a promise and a stretch of empty highway. And his word inside that world had been the kind you earn and bleed for, the kind some men never lived long enough to actually wear. He'd set it all down a long time ago. There'd been a woman. Her name was Carol, and everybody who knew her called her Birdie for a reason nobody could remember anymore. And she'd been the whole reason Amos walked away from the road. She got sick, the slow kind of sick, and Amos parked the bike and sold most of what he owned and spent 4 years learning to be gentle so he could be gentle with her at the end. She died in the front bedroom of the house behind that shop, and Amos was holding her hand, and the last thing he did before he closed her eyes was make her a promise. He said it slow, one word at a time, so it would hold. He said, "I will not go back to that man unless somebody makes me." And then he built a life out of small engines and black coffee and a roll-up door that went up at 7. And for 19 years, nobody made him. Her tools still hung on the pegboard inside, painted outlines so nothing would ever be lost. Her half-restored motorcycle sat under a canvas cover in the back of the shop, untouched, exactly as she'd left it. So now you know who was standing on that frozen lawn in a canvas apron. And now we can go back to the morning, back to the tall man setting Del Callahan's photograph face down on the counter like garbage. Amos had come out of his shop at the sound of the bolt cutter. He came down the sidewalk slow, unhurried, wiping his hands on a rag, and he stopped at the edge of Ruth's lawn, and he looked at the 3 men, and he looked at Ruth in her house coat and slippers in the cold. And then he looked through the open door, and he saw the photograph lying face down on the counter. Something happened in his face then, small, quiet, a door closing somewhere far back behind his eyes. He set the rag down on the fence post, folded once, the way he set everything down. And he came around the gate the way he did everything, slow, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world. And here is where I have to hold you still for a moment, because the walk across that lawn was maybe 40 feet, and it took Amos the better part of 20 seconds to cross it. And every one of those seconds mattered in a way you can only feel if I slow it all the way down. 20 seconds is nothing. You'd spend 20 seconds waiting for a light to change and never think about it again. But a man crossing 40 feet of frozen grass toward 3 younger men, in no hurry at all, at 74 years of age, with his hands loose at his sides and his breath coming out in slow, white clouds, is a man doing arithmetic the whole way. He was counting them. He was counting where they stood and how they stood, and which one carried his weight forward on the balls of his feet, and which one had already half-turned toward the porch and forgotten there was anyone behind him. He was reading the ground, the patch of ice near the bottom step, the loose board on the second stair, the garbage can by the gate. He was doing the thing his hands had never forgotten how to do, even after 19 years of gapping spark plugs and cleaning carburetors, which was to walk into a room and know, before anyone else in it knew, exactly how it would go if it went bad. And the terrible thing, the thing that Nora would understand much later and never be able to say out loud, was that none of it looked like anything. It looked like an old man in an apron, shuffling over to complain about the noise. That was the whole trick of him. That was the thing all those quiet years had built. The four neighbors at the end of the driveway saw a slow old man and looked away, embarrassed for him, sure they were about to watch something sad. The three men on the lawn barely registered him at all. And I want you to sit with that, because it's the same mistake, exactly the same mistake, that a bank made with a hardware store, and a company made with a widow, and that a young man in a slate-gray suit 2 hours away was, at that very minute, in the middle of making without knowing it. The world looks at quiet and reads weak. It reads slow as harmless, and old as finished. It does that over and over, and it never learns, because the men who could teach it the lesson are exactly the men who chose, on purpose, to stop teaching it. Amos Reed had spent 19 years being underestimated on that street, and he had loved every quiet minute of it. He'd have paid money to keep it that way. He'd have given anything short of the one thing he wouldn't give, which was to stand still while somebody put their hands on a widow and a photograph of a dead sailor 40 feet from his own door. Somewhere in the back of that shop, under a canvas cover, a half-restored motorcycle sat exactly where Bertie had left it, and somewhere in Amos, walking that lawn, a voice that sounded like hers was saying the thing she always said when he got that flat look on his face, which was, "Easy, old man, easy." He heard it. He listened to it, the way he'd listened to it for 4 years while she was dying, and 19 years after. He kept it slow. Easy. But easy was not the same thing as stopping, and Bertie, of all people, had known the difference, because Bertie was the one he'd made the promise to, one word at a time, so it would hold. "I will not go back to that man, unless somebody makes me." And somebody, that morning, 40 feet away, with a bolt cutter and a folded paper, and no idea at all what he was standing on, had just gone and made him. The cold did the thing cold does on a morning like that, made every sound too sharp, the crunch of the frost under his boots, the tick of a truck engine cooling somewhere down the road, the small, ugly laugh one of the three men let out at something the tall one said. Amos smelled the two-stroke oil and the cut grass on his own hands, the smell that was the whole of his life now, the smell that meant Tuesday and Wednesday and every ordinary morning for 19 years. And he understood in a plain and settled way that he was about to spend a little of that peace, and that he'd built up enough of it over 19 years that he could afford to. $612. That was the number underneath all of it, the number that had grown teeth in the dark and turned into a padlock on a widow's gate. And Amos didn't know that number yet, not the exact figure, but he knew the shape of the thing, knew it was small, knew that the smallest things are what the cruelty always hides behind. He came up the last few feet of that lawn, and the third man finally noticed him and nudged the second, and the tall one turned around with the paper still in his hand and that easy contempt already sitting on his face. The face of a man who had never once in his life been wrong about who was dangerous in a room. The tall one saw him coming and laughed. He asked Amos if he was the neighborhood watch. Amos stopped a step inside the gate and stood there a half-second longer than he needed to. And he said one thing, quiet. He said, "Pick up the picture." The tall one stopped laughing about 4 seconds later, which was about how long it took him to decide he wasn't going to. And he turned back toward the porch with something dismissive already forming on his mouth. And you never got to say it. What happened next took 9 seconds, maybe 10. Amos was not a big man, and he did not move like a young one. But the years hadn't taken the one thing that had always mattered most about him, which was that he understood exactly where a body's weight lived and exactly how to take it away. The tall one reached out to put a hand on Amos's chest, and Amos folded that arm the wrong way at the elbow, and the man went down onto Ruth's frozen lawn with a sound that made one of the neighbors turn away. The second one, the one with the padlock, came in fast and swinging, and Amos stepped inside the swing, put an elbow into the hinge of his jaw, and let his own momentum put him into the porch rail. 2 down. And then Amos stood up straight, breathing a little hard, and looked at the third man, the youngest, the one who'd gone white and put both hands up. And the whole morning froze right there. Now I know exactly what you want. You want me to let the third one have it and roll credits. That's the part everybody wants to skip straight to. But if I let you skip it, you'll miss the thing that actually matters. So we're going to slow down. Because what Amos did next tells you everything about the man that the fight never could. He didn't touch the third one. He said, "Go." And the boy went, dragging the one with the padlock by the collar, the tall one crawling after them holding his arm, and they got into their car and they backed down Miller Road too fast and clipped a garbage can, and were gone. And then Amos Reed did not stand there breathing hard like a man who'd won something. He walked up onto Ruth Callahan's porch and through her door, and the first thing he did, the very first thing, was pick up the photograph off the counter. He turned it over in both hands, careful, and he looked at Del Callahan in his dress blues for a second. And then he hung it back on its nail above the stove, and stepped back and made sure it was straight. Only then did he turn around and ask Ruth if she was hurt. She wasn't hurt. Nora had come running from the shop, and she stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, looking at Amos the way you look at a man you thought you knew, and suddenly don't. He got Ruth into a kitchen chair. He put the kettle on himself. He swept up the glass from where the storm door had cracked, swept it into a dustpan on his knees at 74 years old, and he poured Ruth a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, and set it in front of her. And then he said the thing he needed her to hear. He said, "They won't send men to your door again." He believed that when he said it, and he was right about that much. What he didn't know was that they were never going to need to. The worst of that morning hadn't introduced itself yet. Here's what happened in the 20 minutes after that car clipped the garbage can and disappeared. The tall one, whose name was Devin, got to a gas station parking lot and called his boss, because a man like Kyle Brandt does not send other men out and then not hear about it when it goes wrong. And Devin, holding his arm at a wrong angle, told Kyle they'd been jumped by some old man from down the street, a nobody in an apron, and Kyle went quiet on the phone, in a way Devin didn't understand yet. Because Kyle Brandt had built Meridian on a very simple rule. Nobody hits back. That was the whole business. You made the paper look scary, and you moved fast, and you never gave anybody a reason to think there was a person on the other end of it who could be reached. An old man who put 2 of his people on the ground on a widow's lawn in front of witnesses was not a variable in the model. It was a threat to the model itself. And a man who has built everything out of fear cannot afford to be seen taking a hit, because the fear is the only thing holding it all up. And the second people believe it can be answered, it all comes down. So it stopped being a shakedown. Right there in a gas station parking lot over a phone, it became something else. It became a cleanup. Kyle Brandt decided that the house was going to be taken, and the old man was going to be made an example of. Not because he was angry, though he was, but because he could not be seen to let it stand. And just like that, the whole shape of it changed. He sent people to find out who the old man was. That was his mistake, though he had no way of knowing it. He had a fixer, a man he used for exactly this kind of thing. An older man named Sal, who'd been around long before Meridian existed. 61 years old, been in and around the rough end of things his whole life. Sal drove out to Miller Road that afternoon and parked across from the little cinder block shop and watched Amos Reed for 20 minutes through a windshield. An old man in an apron, carrying a lawnmower deck in from a truck like it weighed nothing. And Sal took a photograph on his phone and drove back to the city and put that photograph on Kyle Brandt's desk. And Kyle looked at it and said, "So that's him." And Sal didn't answer. Sal was looking at the picture. He'd gone the color of old paper. He asked Kyle where this was, and Kyle told him. And Sal sat down slow in the chair across the desk, and he took off his hat and turned it over in his hands, once, twice, looking at the inside of it. And then he said a name out loud. He said, "That's Amos Reed." And Kyle said, "So what?" And Sal said the thing that changed the temperature in the room. He said, "You don't know that name, because you're too young to know that name." There were 3 younger men in that office, Kyle's people, and Sal turned to them and told them a story none of them had ever heard. He told them about a time before any of them were born, about a stretch of coast highway and a handful of men who'd built something out of nothing but nerve, and about one of those men in particular, a man whose word was the only law that world recognized. A man other hard men would cross a room to avoid crossing. He told them Amos Reed had walked away clean, which almost nobody ever did, and that walking away clean the way he had meant the thing he'd walked away from had let him go, which meant it still knew his name. Kyle Brandt sat behind his desk in his slate-gray suit and listened to an old fixer tell ghost stories, and the compass tattoo on his wrist itched the way it did when he was deciding something. And at the end of it he said, "That was 40 years ago. Those men are dead or in the ground or too old to sit on a bike." And Sal looked at him and said the worst thing he could have said, which was the truth. He said, "I can't promise you that." And Kyle wanted a yes or a no, and all Sal could give him was, "I can't promise you." And that not knowing sat in the room worse than any yes would have. Kyle should have listened. Everything after this is the story of a young man who could not afford to listen, because listening would have meant admitting he was afraid, and admitting he was afraid was the one thing his whole life had been built to never do again. There was another man who tried to stop it, and I want you to know about him, because he was right, and it cost him nothing but the satisfaction of being right, which is the loneliest kind of correct there is. His name was Harlan Voss, and he'd been a deputy in that county for 26 years, and he'd seen Meridian coming from a long way off. He'd sat across a desk from a man from Meridian's legal end months back and put one finger down on the file and told him plain, "You're going to push one of these old folks too far one of these days, and my people are going to have to stand in front of whatever comes back." And the man from Meridian had smiled the company smile and thanked him for his concern. When word reached Harlan Voss that there'd been an incident on Miller Road, and then when word reached him a day later about the name Amos Reed, he did something he probably shouldn't have. He drove out to that cinder block shop himself, alone, in his own truck, out of uniform. He found Amos changing the oil on a riding mower, and he stood in the doorway a minute, and then he said, "I know who you are." And Amos didn't stop working. He said, "I'm a man who fixes small engines." And Harlan said, "That's who you are now. I'm asking you about before." And Amos wiped his hands and looked at him and asked him what he came to say. Harlan told him Meridian wasn't going to let it lie, that the auction was still on the calendar, that a man like Kyle Brandt couldn't afford to be seen backing down, and that whatever Amos was planning, the county didn't have the men to hold the line if it went bad. And Amos looked at Harlan Voss for a long moment and said something that Harlan carried around for the rest of his life. He said, "I'm not planning anything. I'm just going to be there." And Harlan asked him, "Be there with what?" And Amos didn't answer. Hold on to that morning for one more breath, because the first answer came fast, and it came with hands, and the second answer was going to be nothing of the kind, and everything between them was Amos getting ready without ever once looking like a man getting ready. The auction was set for a Saturday morning, on the courthouse steps 2 towns over, the way these things are done, in public, in the open, so nobody can say it wasn't legal. Meridian had the paper. The county had signed off. $612, grown into a number with fees and interest and penalties stacked so high that Ruth Callahan's 44-year home was going to be sold for a fraction of what it was worth to whoever showed up with a checkbook. And everybody understood that the only checkbook that was going to show up belonged to Meridian, because Kyle Brandt had made sure the word got around that bidding against him on this one was a bad idea for your health. Ruth found out on a Wednesday. She came down to the shop and she couldn't finish the sentence, and Nora held her, and Amos stood there wiping a part that was already clean. And then he set it down and said, "I need everybody to go home tonight and sleep, and I need Ruth to be on that courthouse steps Saturday morning at 9, in her good coat, standing up straight. That's all I need." And Ruth asked him what he was going to do, and Amos said, "I'm going to make a phone call." He made more than one. That night after the roll-up door came down, Amos Reed sat in the back of his shop next to Bertie's motorcycle under its canvas cover, and he opened a small steel box he kept on the top shelf, a box he'd checked once a day for 19 years and never once needed. Inside it, folded, was a piece of leather with wings on it and a name, and he took it out and set it on the workbench in the low light, both hands, careful, the way you handle a thing that means more than you can say. He didn't put it on, he just looked at it. And then he picked up the phone and he called that same number back, the one he'd let go cold for 11 years before that first afternoon. And a man answered on the second ring, and Amos said, "It's me." And the man on the other end didn't say anything for a second, and then he said, "Where and when?" And Amos told him. And the man said, "How many do you want?" And Amos said, "I don't want any of you swinging on anybody. I want you parked. I want you legal. I want them to see you and understand and go home. That's all." And the man said, "That's all we ever needed to do," and hung up. Nora didn't go home that night. She sat in the doorway of the shop and watched him, and she said, "I know what that thing is." She'd seen the photograph. She'd figured it out over the 8 months, the way the whole street would go a certain kind of careful around him. The way an old man on a Harley had rolled through once last summer and taken his helmet off and called Amos by a name she'd never heard, and then just sat with him for an hour, saying nothing. She said, "Let me stay." And Amos looked at her for a long time, and the reason he wanted her gone had nothing to do with fear for her, because he knew nobody was going to lay a hand on anybody if he did this right. The reason he wanted her gone was that he did not want her watching him become, even a little, even for one morning, the man he used to be. He'd spent 19 years and a promise to a dying woman, making sure that man stayed folded up in a steel box on a high shelf. But he looked at Nora, at the girl who'd shown up with a black eye and a duffel bag, and had learned in his shop that a man could be strong and gentle at the same time. And he understood that sending her away would teach her the wrong lesson. The lesson that, when it gets hard, the people who love you disappear. So he said, "All right, you stand next to Ruth, you hold her arm, and whatever you see, you keep her standing up straight. Can you do that?" And Nora said she could. Saturday morning came gray and cold. Ruth Callahan stood on the courthouse steps in her good coat with her back straight and Nora's arm through hers. And there was a small crowd, the way there always is. The buyers and the curious, and a few neighbors from Miller Road who'd driven over because they couldn't stand not to. The auctioneer set up his little podium, and Kyle Brandt was there in his slate gray suit, standing off to the side with Sal and two of his younger men. And he was there in person for a reason. He was there because a man who's decided to make an example needs to be seen making it. He wanted Ruth to watch him take her house. He wanted the old man, if the old man showed up, to watch too. He checked his watch. 9 o'clock. And that was when they heard it. Far off at first, low, more felt than heard, a sound coming up the road toward the courthouse square. And it grew, and it grew, and it became the sound of a great many engines moving slow and together with no intention of stopping anywhere they weren't wanted. Heads turned. The auctioneer paused with his gavel half up, and around the corner they came, 2 by 2, motorcycles, and behind them more, and behind those more still, rolling into the square slow and orderly and filling every legal parking space along all 4 sides of it, and then lining up in a second row behind the first, engines idling and then going quiet, one by one. 41 bikes. I counted them for you, so you'd know it wasn't a figure of speech. 41. And the men who got off them were not young men, most of them. They were gray and heavy and slow getting off the bikes. 60s and 70s, some of them moving like their knees hurt. And they did not shout, and they did not brandish anything, and they did not so much as raise their voices. They took off their helmets, and they stood, in a long, silent line all the way around that square, arms folded, facing the courthouse steps. And on the back of every one of those jackets was the same set of wings, the same name, the mark that Sal had gone the color of old paper looking at 3 days before. And through the middle of them, slow, unhurried, walked Amos Reed. He wasn't wearing his apron. He was wearing the leather from the steel box, the wings over his heart. And he walked up to the bottom of the courthouse steps, and he stopped. And he didn't look at Kyle Brandt at all. He looked at Ruth. And he nodded at her, once. And she stood up a little straighter. Sal reached over and put a hand on Kyle Brandt's arm and said, very quiet into his ear, "We need to leave." And Kyle didn't move. Because Kyle Brandt could see, plain as anybody, that not one law was being broken. The bikes were parked legal. The men were standing on public ground. Nobody had said a threatening word. There was nothing for a deputy to arrest, nothing for a lawyer to file on, nothing at all except 41 silent old men, and the simple, total, immovable fact of them. That's the thing Kyle had never understood about the world his father tried to teach him. Power isn't the paper in your hand. Power is who comes and stands in the square when you need them to. And Kyle Brandt had built an empire on the certainty that nobody ever came, that everybody was alone, that fear worked because there was never anybody on the other end who could be reached. And here, in the cold, in the open, in front of the whole town, was the disproof of the only thing he believed. 41 men had come, and they hadn't even had to break the law to do it. The auctioneer looked at the crowd and looked at the men and looked at his gavel. And he did the only thing a reasonable man could do. He cleared his throat and said the property could still be redeemed if the outstanding amount was paid in full before the sale concluded. And that was the moment Nora Callahan let go of her grandmother's arm and walked down the courthouse steps. She had something in her hand. It was an envelope, and it was thick. And she walked right up to the auctioneer's podium, and she set it down, and she said, in a voice that only shook a little, $612, plus every fee they stacked on it, counted twice. It's all there. And here's the part you need to understand. That money hadn't come from Amos. It had come from the men. 41 of them had passed a helmet down the line the night before in a parking lot 2 counties over, and old men on fixed incomes had filled it, 20s and 50s, and one man's entire monthly pension in cash, because one of their own had made a call. And that was the only reason any of them needed. Kyle Brandt watched Nora set that envelope down, and he watched the auctioneer count it, and you could see the math land on his face in real time. There was no house to take. There was no example to make. There was no crime to answer. There was only a widow with her home paid clear, and 41 witnesses, and his own 2 men still limping from Wednesday. And every single arithmetic he ran came out the same. He'd lost. Not to force, to being outnumbered by decency, and unable to lay a finger on any of it. Sal took his arm again, and this time Kyle let himself be turned around, and the 2 of them and the younger men walked back toward the black cars parked on the far side of the square. And here is where it might have ended, except Amos Reed said one word. He said, "Brandt." And Kyle stopped, because the voice that said it was quiet and did not shake at all. And most people who told Kyle Brandt anything said it with their voices shaking. Amos didn't come toward him. He just stood at the bottom of the steps in his colors and said, plain so the whole square could hear it, "You sent men to a widow's door, and one of them put his hands on a photograph of a sailor who's been dead 9 years. I'm not going to touch you. These men aren't going to touch you. But every one of us is going to remember your name. And so is everybody standing in this square. And you are going to have to build the rest of your life knowing that a whole town watched you lose to an old man in an apron." And then Amos did the only cruel thing he did all morning. And it wasn't cruel at all. It was just true. He said, "Your daddy stood in a parking lot once and let them take everything and never said a word. I'm sorry for that. But son, you learned the wrong half of it." And Kyle Brandt stood in the cold with the compass on his wrist and didn't say anything. Because there wasn't anything to say. And then he got in the black car, and it drove away. They left the way people leave a funeral. Quiet, careful, nobody looking back. And the 41 men put their helmets back on and started their engines, one at a time. And they didn't do a victory lap or a burnout or anything a younger crowd might have done. They just pulled out 2 by 2 the way they'd come. And one by one they rolled past the courthouse steps, and every single one of them slowed as he passed Ruth Callahan and nodded to her. 41 nods. And then the square was empty and quiet again, and it was just Ruth and Nora and Amos standing there in the cold with a paid receipt in an envelope. Amos took off the leather, folded it once, both hands, and put it under his arm. And he asked Ruth if she wanted a cup of tea. That afternoon, he opened the roll-up door at the shop even though it was a Saturday, and Saturdays he usually kept for himself, and he put the leather back in its steel box on the high shelf, both hands, careful, and he closed the lid and he set the box back where it lived. Nora watched him do it from the doorway and didn't say anything. And he didn't either. And that was the whole conversation. And it was enough. Now let me tell you what happened to Meridian Asset Recovery, because this is the part that actually finishes it. And it finished the way these things finish when the sun finally gets under the door. Deputy Harlan Voss, who'd been right all along and had taken no pleasure in it, had spent months quietly keeping a file. And after that Saturday, people started coming forward. Because people are only afraid until they see somebody else stop being afraid. And once one widow talked, another one did. And then a man who'd lost a machine shop the same way. And inside a month, the county attorney had a stack of sworn statements about forged notices and doctored fee schedules, and letters printed to look confusing on purpose, and the whole thing came apart. There was a state investigation, and then a federal one, and Meridian's own records, kept too well by people who thought they'd never be read, laid out every trick in order, and Kyle Brandt's signature was at the bottom of most of it. Sal, the old fixer who'd gone the color of paper, was the first one to sit down with the investigators, and he told them everything. And when they asked him why, he said he'd spent his whole life on the wrong side of a certain kind of line, and he'd finally seen the other side of it standing in a courthouse square, 41 men deep, and he'd decided which side he wanted to have been on when it was over. Meridian collapsed inside of a month. The debts it held were unwound, and every one of those houses went back to the people who'd lived in them. And the smallest of those, the last one on the list, was a widow named Ruth Callahan, whose home had never really been in danger at all, because a man 2 doors down had picked up a phone. Kyle Brandt did not go to prison for as long as some people wanted, which is how it usually goes. But he lost the company and the suits and the watch and the whole architecture of fear he'd spent his 20s building, and he had to build the rest of his life exactly the way Amos told him he would, knowing a town had watched him lose. And here's the part I almost didn't believe when I first heard it. About 2 years later, a letter came to the little cinder-block shop on Miller Road, no return address, and inside it was a single sheet of paper and a check made out to the county for $612, the original amount, and the note said only, "You were right about my father." It didn't ask for anything. It didn't try to make itself smaller than it was. It just said that one true thing and stopped. And Amos read it once and put it in a drawer and never talked about it. And I'd like to think that somewhere in a smaller life than the one he'd planned, Kyle Brandt had finally learned the whole lesson instead of half of it. The town mostly let Amos's past lie after that. They knew now, of course, everybody knew. But Miller Road was the kind of place that understood a man is allowed to decide who he's going to be. And so they went right on bringing him their lawnmowers and their outboards. And he went right on opening the roll-up door at 7 in the morning, 6 days a week. And the whole street went right on smelling like two-stroke oil and cut grass and coffee. Nora stayed. She'd had a clear road out of that town any day she wanted to take it, and she chose to stay. And she poured him a cup of black coffee every morning at 7:10, and he never asked for it, and she never stopped bringing it. The years went by the way years do, quiet. And one winter morning, the roll-up door didn't go up at 7, and Nora walked down and found him in the chair by the workbench, gone in his sleep, 79 years old. And the shop was warm, and the coffee was still in the pot. Half the town came to the funeral. The other half was too young to know why it mattered, and that was all right, because the ones who needed to be there were there. And a dozen old men rode in from a long way off and stood at the back with their helmets under their arms and didn't say much. Nora kept the shop. She kept the hour. She still opens that door at 7, 6 days a week, because that's just how the place runs now. and the steel box is still up on the high shelf where he left it, and inside it the leather is folded exactly the way he folded it, both hands, careful, that last Saturday afternoon. It sits there, year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Think back for a moment to where this whole thing started. A bolt cutter on a chain, a widow in slippers in the cold, a photograph set face down on a counter like trash. It looked, in that first moment, like exactly the thing the world does too often, the strong taking from the weak because they'd decided the weak couldn't hit back. 3 men in good boots looked at a 74-year-old in an oil-stained apron and saw a nobody, saw somebody safe to walk past. But that's the thing about quiet men. The quiet isn't weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice made by a man who has already been everywhere violence can take a person and decided, on purpose, over a promise to a dying woman, to come back from it and stay back. What Kyle Brandt should have seen, what those 3 men on the lawn should have seen, was a man who'd set down a terrible burden a long, long time ago, and who would pick it back up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, in a leather jacket from a steel box, and then fold it up and set it down again for good. He never raised his voice, he never made a threat. He answered a padlock and a paper with 41 men standing silent and legal in the cold, and that was enough. Because in the end, power was never the thing in Kyle Brandt's hand. It was who came and stood in the square. And Amos Reed, at 74, in an apron, 2 doors down, was the kind of man for whom 41 of them would come without being asked twice. So let me leave you with this. The fight on the lawn was never the interesting part, and neither was the auction. The interesting part was a 19-year habit of opening a door at 7, and a cup of coffee nobody asked for, and a promise made 1 word at a time to a woman named Birdie, so it would hold. That's where the whole thing actually lived. I want to ask you something real, not a throwaway. When Nora walked down those courthouse steps with that envelope in her hand, the one filled by 41 old men passing a helmet down a line, what did that do to you? Sit with it a second, and tell me down in the comments, because I read every single one. I mean that, all of them. And if this is your first time sitting with us, welcome. This is what we do here. We tell stories about the quiet ones the world underestimates, the men who kept their word when keeping your word stopped being worth anything to anybody, and the debts of kindness that come back around years later when you least expect them. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, stick around, stay a while. There's no rush. I've put 2 more stories right up on the screen for you, one about a widow and a mechanic, and one about a debt that took 30 years to come home. And thank you, honestly, for caring enough about a quiet old man in an apron to sit with him all the way to the end. It means more than you know.